Life Audio. Welcome to the Untangling Prayer Podcast. I'm Rachel Wojo, and each week we unravel life's knots through prayer. Here you'll find practical wisdom and prayer encouragement to guide you through life's hardest seasons. Join me as we untangle life's messes together, one prayer at a time. Welcome to the Untangling Prayer Podcast. I'm Rachel, and I'm so glad you're here. Have you ever felt so mentally overwhelmed that your prayer life suffers? Not because you don't want to pray, but because your mind feels too cluttered to form the words. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone, and this episode is for you. Today we're talking about prayer during seasons of mental overload, when we want to connect with God, but our minds feel too chaotic to focus or too bogged down to figure out what to say. This is something I explore in my book, Desperate Prayers, Embracing the Power of Prayer in Life's Darkest Moments. And if you've struggled to pray because life feels overwhelming, this book offers encouragement for those moments when your mental and emotional resources are depleted. The good news? God understands our exhaustion and meets us where we are. Even in our most overwhelmed state, He invites us to come with our authentic, exhausted selves and not so perfect prayers. Today, we'll explore how God responds when we're too tired to pray and how to find rest for our souls in life's most chaotic moments. Let's get started. Our first segment is Questions in Hard Places. The question is, how do I pray when I'm too mentally overloaded? When life feels chaotic, prayer often becomes one of the first spiritual practices to suffer. Not because we don't value it, but because our mental resources are stretched thin. Yet these are precisely the moments when we need prayer the most. Psalm 62 verses 1 through 8 tells us about finding rest in God during overwhelming times. Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from Him. Truly, He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. Trust in Him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to Him, for God is our refuge. Notice the words, truly my soul finds rest in God. Not my mind creates these perfect prayers, or not my discipline earns God's attention. Simply, my soul finds rest. And verse 8 invites us to pour out our hearts to the Lord. This isn't about formulating, it's about expression, honestly. When mental overload hits, we often feel we need to get ourselves together before we can go to God. But the psalmist is suggesting the opposite. Bring your scattered, exhausted self to God first, and you will find the rest that you need. What might prayer look like when your mind is too overwhelmed? Well, sometimes it's just sitting in silence, acknowledging God's presence. You can repeat a phrase simply like, you are my rock, or it could be tears without words, or even a deep sigh. I often refer to Romans 8:26 because it reassures my heart so very much. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. God isn't waiting for your mental clarity before He'll listen. He's inviting you to come as you are, mentally overloaded and all, and find your rest in Him. Thanks for tuning in to Questions in Hard Places. We'll be right back after this brief word from our sponsors.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to Ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
Thank you for listening in to that word from our sponsors. And now for this week's segment of Pray More, Worry Less encouragement. Finding sacred rest when your mind is overwhelmed. You know, in our fast-paced world, mental overload has become somewhat of a badge of honor. We glorify busyness, we fill every moment with productivity, and we bombard ourselves with social media. No wonder our prayer lives suffer because our minds really don't know how to slow down. Psalm 62:8 reminds us, "Trust in Him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to Him, for God is our refuge." And I'm so glad that it doesn't say to pour out your perfectly organized thoughts. It just simply says pour out your hearts. God welcomes your mess. He welcomes the overwhelmed reality of who we are. As I wrote in Desperate Prayers, our weakest prayerful pleas to God are the beginning of our strongest moments. Now let's dive into this topic a little bit more. When mental overload affects your prayer life, the solution isn't always try harder, right? Sometimes it's recognizing our limitations and finding that sacred rest. So here are 3 ways to navigate prayer when your mind feels cluttered. Number 1, identify the type of exhaustion you're experiencing. And I talk about this topic in my book, One More Step, Finding Strength When You Feel Like Giving Up. And understanding the type of exhaustion that you're experiencing is so important because different exhaustion requires different responses, right? Physical exhaustion might mean that you just need sleep before you can pray. Mental exhaustion might require simplifying your approach to prayer. Emotional exhaustion often calls for compassion on yourself first, giving yourself grace. And then spiritual exhaustion might mean receiving rather than generating. So listening to scripture or playing worship music instead of working on producing prayers. Psalm 62:5 reminds us, "Yes, my soul find rest in God. My hope comes from Him." Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is just tell God you're tired and allow Him to respond accordingly. Number 2, after we identify the type of exhaustion that we have, then we have to replace performance with presence. When we're overloaded, we often feel like we have to perform. We want to create a perfect environment or create a perfect setting. We want to have a perfect focus. But sometimes prayer, in difficult seasons especially, is simply about being present. Psalm 62:2 says, "Truly He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken." This isn't about what we do, but who God is. Try shifting from prayer as performance to prayer as presence. Simply sitting with the awareness that this verse is true, that God is your rock, He is your salvation, He is your fortress, and you do not have to be shaken. Let your breathing become the prayer when you're... So replace that performance with presence. And then thirdly, after we identify the type of exhaustion and we replace performance with presence, we then can create the boundaries to protect our mental space. Mental overload often results from eroded boundaries, constant notifications, or the inability to say no. These all contribute to a mind too cluttered for prayer. So creating boundaries isn't selfish. It recognizes that your connection with God needs space. So maybe consider a Sabbath where all your devices go silent and you have no internet access or turn off all internet access except for emergencies in order to strengthen your connection with God and create a space where you can schedule this specific worry-free time so that these issues don't interrupt your thoughts. Learn to say not now to opportunities that overextend you. Creating boundaries creates space where prayer can breathe again. And if you find yourself too exhausted to pray, too mentally overloaded to pray, then I believe that you can find that space if you will create a few boundaries. Protecting your mental space. Mental overload doesn't disqualify you from prayer. If you're feeling like you just can't even pray at all, what this does is it changes how prayer looks for your season. God isn't intimidated by your exhaustion or your scattered thoughts. I have so been there. He meets us there, offering rest for our weary souls, and I'm so thankful. This week, you could ask yourself a few questions. What type of exhaustion am I experiencing? So identify it. Is it physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual? And what if I released all the performance pressure and just focused on being present with God? And then finally, to think about what boundary needs to be established to protect my mental space. The God who created your mind understands your personal limitations, and He's not waiting for your organized thoughts. He's inviting you to pour out your heart and find rest in Him. This week's answer prayer story is about finding sight. God's most powerful work often happens when we're overwhelmed, and this was true when I was 19 years old and needed a cornea transplant for my left eye. The diagnosis was overwhelming. I could have lost my vision, and it was easy to worry and fear. I was young. My parents, of course, carried their own burden of worry and concern, and they faced this medical crisis with a special kind of mental overload, I'm sure. Their minds were cluttered with medical terminology, fears about the procedure of a cornea transplant, and the weight of trying to manage all of it. But in their overload, they did do one thing. They prayed that my eye would be spared. And I'm sure those prayers were desperate as we waited in the hospital for 4 days in order to receive a transplant. But it finally came. The anxious waiting afterwards was, would the transplant take? Would my vision be restored? So once the surgery was completed and the transplant proved successful, I think we all recognized that God had answered an overwhelmed, repeated prayer, that despite my parents' mental exhaustion and scattered thoughts, God heard them and my vision was preserved. You know, when we're too overwhelmed to form perfect prayers, even our simplest requests reach Him. My parents' cry of "spare her eye" was enough. God met them and did not despise their pleas. Mental overload isn't something that creates distance between us and God. It just reveals how close God really is. When our minds are scattered, God understands the language of our worried hearts. And if mental overload has affected your life, remember my parents' simple prayer through exhaustion and how God answered it faithfully, not because of my elegance or eloquence, not because of their eloquence, but because of God's character. Pour out your heart. Let tears be prayers when words fall. Trust that God receives even wordless groans as meaningful communication. Mental overload doesn't disqualify our prayers. It just might make them more authentic. This answer prayer story is similar to ones that I share in my book, Desperate Prayers, Embracing the Power of Prayer in Life's Darkest Moments. And if you're wondering if God hears you when your mind is too overwhelmed to form prayers, This book will offer comfort. Desperate Prayers is available as an ebook, audiobook at desperateprayers.com, Amazon, Christian Book, or wherever you buy books. Thank you for joining me on Untangling Prayer. I'm Rachel Wojo, and remember, God sees you, He hears you, and He knows your needs. Thanks for joining me on the Untangling Prayer podcast. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who could use a little hope. And be sure to subscribe for more. Until next time, keep seeking, keep trusting, and keep praying.
Hi, I'm Beckett Cook, host of The Beckett Cook Show. I lived as a gay man in Hollywood for many years until I had a radical encounter with Jesus 13 years ago. Since then, I've gotten my master's degree in seminary and published a book called A Change of Affection. On my podcast, The Beckett Cook Show, I sit down with fascinating Christian scholars and thinkers to address the lies of the culture and bring the biblical truth to bear on those lies. To start listening now, go to lifeaudio.com or search for The Beckett Cook Show on your favorite podcasting platform.